Hello, Dark Case family. Welcome home. Queena Phu is renowned amongst her friends and family for having the most infectious smile. Her optimism seems boundless. When people are around her, she has a way of making them feel like anything is possible. This is despite the fact that for Queena, some of the things she encourages in others, she can no longer do herself. At 34 years old, she's had to get used to a new way of life, one that is very different than the way she once thought things would be at 18. Back in April of 2008, she just celebrated her birthday, and she was just finishing her senior year of high school. Queena really loved to read. She was always going to the library, and while she was there, she would check out new books at a speed her friends couldn't even fathom. "Finished already?" the librarian would say, as Queena would come in smiling, excitedly browsing the shelves for new books. And Queena's mum, Vanna, encouraged her reading. She was incredibly proud of her daughter for making the kind of life for herself in America that Vanna could only dreamed of when she was leaving Vietnam all those years ago in 1981. Mother Vanna had escaped on the floor of a small boat, travelling across the South China Sea and leaving behind everything she knew to start again in America. Even then, she knew that she'd be giving her future children better opportunities than if she'd stayed put. Vanna's father had been an officer in the South Vietnamese army, and when North Vietnam took over the country in 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War, he was imprisoned. Bombing had destroyed most of Vietnam's infrastructure, and where rice and vegetation had once grown in abundance, it was now stripped bare after toxic chemicals like Agent Orange had been used. So people made difficult and dangerous journeys to flee to different parts of the world, having to rebuild everything they once knew. As soon as Vanna's father was freed, he put his daughter on a refugee boat, and Vanna eventually made it to California before she went to the Tampa Bay area in Florida, where she started a family. She believed that because she'd already been through such difficulties, her daughters now wouldn't have to. They lived in the land of the free, the land of boundless opportunity, the place where if you just work hard enough, the American dream is yours for the taking. And this is why when Queena's life changed completely in 2008, Vanna just didn't see it coming. Queena had just won a full-time scholarship to the University of Florida. She spent most of her time either at school or volunteering when she wasn't reading. She'd also just started a new part-time job at Abercrombie & Fitch, hoping to save money to spend over the summer where she could celebrate finishing school and hopefully be the top of her graduating class. She and her close friend Rachel Saltonfuss were planning out the places that they wanted to go together over the break, but they knew that wherever they went, they now had to be a little more careful. Both of them had heard about a terrible assault of a daycare worker in the area, so after the attack, Queena and her friends became extra cautious. So on April 24th, 2008, when she finished her shift, and she then decided to return her library books, she rang Rachel from her car. "I've noticed someone strange on a bench outside," she said. "Can you stay on the phone so we can keep chatting?" Queena asked, and Rachel agreed, but she didn't know when she did that this would be one of the last times she'd hear Queena speak a full sentence for a very, very long time. The connection went quiet as Queena opened the car door. Rachel could hear the door chime beginning to beep. She pictured Queena getting out of the car and reaching for her stack of books. Rachel smiled to herself. Knowing Queena, the pile would have been huge. She then heard her friend's breathing, slow and steady, and she waited for her to come back to the call as she walked into the library. But what Rachel heard next, she wasn't prepared for. Rather than Queena asking her how her day was, or overhearing as she went into the building, instead, she heard a long, loud, blood-curdling scream. And then the line went dead. "Queena?" Rachel asked worriedly, but there was complete silence. "Queena?" she asked again. Rachel immediately tried to call back to make sure that everything was okay, but this time her friend's phone went straight to voicemail.
"Hey, it's Queena. I'm not here right now. Just leave a message and I'll call you back."
Rachel tried not to panic. I'm sure we've all done that thing where you're trying to phone someone back, but it just so happens to be at exactly the same time they're trying to call you, so the call just won't connect. A pretty reasonable explanation. And then Rachel remembered that after they heard about the attack in the area, she and Queena had swapped their families' numbers. Rachel tried a mutual friend first who lived close to the library to see if she could find out exactly what had happened, and then immediately after that she called Queena's mum. "I'm not sure what's happened," she said, "but something isn't right." It was the mutual friend that arrived first in the car park. She scanned hurriedly for Queena's car, and that is when she noticed something strange. The door was left wide open, and as the friend got closer, she heard that the car was still running. Queena's phone was on the ground, shattered, and concerningly, a deep red liquid stained the concrete. She immediately called the police, terrified for her friend's safety. The police quickly arrived at the same time as Mother Vanna and Queena's sister Anna both did. Everyone had the same question on their mind. Where was Queena? The police started to fan out to search the nearby area. They looked under the other parked cars, and then spread out to check the library and its surroundings. One officer called out. There was a shape just behind the library building. As this officer got closer, he could just about tell what he was seeing was indeed Queena. But it was difficult to tell. Her face and body were so badly beaten. Lines of ants had already started crawling over her, covering her with bites. Queena had also been terribly violated. It wasn't immediately clear if she was even still alive. The officer checked her pulse, her heart still beating, still drawing breaths, but just barely. Immediately, the police called an ambulance to airlift Queena to hospital. A huge number of medical staff and 13 doctors waited to jump into action the second she arrived, and this team tried desperately to save her. But then Queena fell into a coma. Mother Vanna was frozen in shock. Who could have done this to her daughter? Queena was supposed to have come home that night just like any other, walking through the door with new books in hand, and no doubt some funny stories from her shift. Vanna sobbed. She instead saw Queena in the hospital bed, laying in front of her, taking painful breaths, hooked up to life support. She was still there when Queena temporarily regained consciousness the next day. The daughter was just able to choke out a few questions. "Why can't I see?" she asked, and Vanna sobbed harder, unable to tell her daughter that she'd been blinded during the ordeal, and that doctors thought there was a very strong possibility she'd never see again. Queena would then come in and out of consciousness over the next few hours. Thankfully, it seemed like she was regaining consciousness for good. The bouts of unresponsiveness seemed to have come to an end, but this respite was cruelly short-lived. Just as it seemed things were getting better, they once more took a turn for the worse. Later that afternoon, she started having seizures. This was due to the head trauma and a growing pressure inside her head. To reduce the swelling in her brain, doctors performed emergency surgery. Vanna sat waiting for Queena in her hospital room after the procedure was complete. She hoped that she'd now be able to talk to her daughter, but instead the doctors had to place her in a medically induced coma. Queena had been too unstable to bring back around. Vanna didn't know if she'd hear her daughter's voice ever again, nor if she'd be able to hear the comforting words that she was offering her. She was determined to get justice for Queena, that whoever had done this would be held accountable. The police started their search for the suspect. They received a tip about the man on the bench outside the library. Could this be the very same man that Queena had mentioned to Rachel whilst on the phone? The person providing the tip explained that they knew the man, that they had both been in high school together. The man's name was Kendrick Morris. The police noted it down, unsure yet whether he would be a witness or a suspect. The police investigation took them to the library searching for clues. As one of the places that Queena had visited most regularly, they hoped that they could talk to someone there who could help the investigation. And by chance, Kendrick Morris walked inside at the same time to use one of the library computers. An officer recognized him from the tip-off. When he'd received the call, he'd looked Kendrick up and saw he had a previous charge for cruelty to animals. And as we know, this is an extraordinarily concerning behavioral marker. They took him in for questioning and took his fingerprints. An item of cutlery from a Wendy's diner had been left at the crime scene. This had fingerprint evidence on it, meaning it could be analysed against Kendrick's details. The police also had DNA evidence from the intimate samples they'd taken following the violation, so they now had multiple ways that they could tie a suspect to the crime. Back in the station, they ran Kendrick's fingerprints against the cutlery. It was around this time that police informed mother Vanna that they may have found Queena's attacker, and the case was progressing. Everyone then waited anxiously for the results to come back. Was this force of evil about to be taken off the streets? When the police arrived at the hospital, in which Vanna had been sat in bedside vigil of her beloved daughter, she knew that it could only mean one thing. They had an update on the case. Vanna, an officer started. The DNA was a match. Kendrick Morris was the one who did this. The mother was speechless. All she wanted to ask Kendrick was why he'd hurt her daughter. The police mentioned that he was also the suspect for the other assault that had happened in the area, the one that had made Queena and Rachel start taking extra precautions. Queena was still in a coma whilst all of this was happening. In fact, 3 full weeks passed before she was woken up again, but nobody could know 100% the extent of her injuries at that stage. And after Queena finally opened her eyes, the doctors finally told her heartbroken mother that her daughter had suffered enormous brain injuries. She would no longer be able to walk, eat without assistance, or talk. It was almost impossible for this doting mother to accept that Queena would never be able to enjoy the small things in life that brought her so much joy. Simply walking into the library, hiring and reading books. These all seemed like cruel impossibilities now. Now it was time to fight for all of the ordinary things that Vanna could see would now actually be extraordinary feats for her daughter. But despite everything that had happened, Queena's smile was still the same. Her whole face would light up when she saw different friends and family members, and when she smiled, Vanna was reminded that her daughter was still very much there. Queena had survived, but her journey of rehabilitation would be a slow one, and despite her ongoing hard work, her paralysis was permanent. She was unable to speak, and her brain injuries would never heal. One dream of Queena had been to attend prom, an experience that was robbed from her by Kendrick Morris. However, 9 years after the attack, she was finally able to live out her dream. Longtime best friend Derek Perez proposed to her, and Queena accepted. They would go on to attend the event together, cheered on by the community and friends. Queena finally made it to her prom. Although usually a celebration of graduating high school, Mother Vanna saw this prom a little differently. It was a celebration of her amazing Queena still being alive, of her surviving against all odds. She wore a lilac dress with flowing sleeves, her hair brushed and twisted into an updo. Queena looked radiant. The prom marked the beginning of a different chapter for Queena. These days, and almost 2 decades after the attack, Queena still lives with her mother. She still does daily physio, trying to improve her strength a little each day. And although she didn't regain her ability to move completely by herself, she never lost the way that she could make other people feel. Neighbours, family and friends will drop by just to sit with her, just grateful that Queena is still here. And now, in a touching display of love, Vanna reads aloud to her daughter, making sure she doesn't miss out on one of the things she loved the most. Kendrick Morris was charged for his crimes against Queena. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 concurrent 65-year sentences. And although he requested and was granted a resentencing hearing in 2017, instead of shortening his prison time, he was instead given life without the possibility of parole.